The 2025 Los Angeles wildfires are a disaster without comparison in American history, with losses of the 200,000-acre fire estimated to be well over $100 billion and the number of deaths ever climbing. With the cause of the disaster yet to be determined, the destructive nature of fire is on full display for the world to see, as if anyone needed a reminder. All the sages and prophets of man, prior to the modern age, would have traded every word they scribed to see the day of the atomic bomb. It's not likely that the human mind, dwelling in ancient times, could have imagined such a device. Unleashing the power of the atom on people was a unique moment in history, one that has not been repeated since the two bombs were set off by the United States Air Force in 1945. You see, humans don't need weapons with the capability of splitting the atom to do immense damage to one another. We've been able to kill untold numbers with the most basic element in nature: fire. From the god of Israel punishing Pharaoh with fire from above, to the Roman god Vulcan causing volcanoes on the Italian mainland to erupt, the ancients had a complex relationship with fire. One famous Greek myth had Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humans in the form of innovation and civilization. If Prometheus had seen the future, had seen how humans would manipulate fire to kill one another, he may well have thought twice about giving it to us. Humans have been using fire as a weapon since recorded history began, from Greek fire to flaming arrows to tar barrels loaded in catapults. Where the will to harm another person arose, so too was the innovation to harness flames to carry out this duty. Famously, Troy was burned to the ground after a 10-year siege, as the story goes. And if legends don't fancy you, then the accounts of the Romans burning Carthage and Jerusalem, along with the Hebrews' Second Temple, might prove all the more that fire was both an effective weapon during battle and a deterrent to would-be rebels. Fire was often reserved as a most extreme punishment for the most devious crime. Of course, innocent people like those accused of witchcraft or sorcery also met their end in the flames, Joan of Arc being a famous example, proving that humans reserved fire for the most hated of rivals and criminals, and not to be used against just anybody. Fast forward to the modern age. The trenches of World War I saw a bevy of weapons designed to burn the enemy alive. From flamethrowers to incendiary bombs dropped from blimps, the Great War took humans one step closer to perfecting flames as a weapon against an enemy. But something happened during the war, an awakening, if you will, that using such dastardly weapons against your fellow man was not a way to wage a modern war. It was too uncivilized a weapon to be used by so-called gentlemen. And so, as the war wound down, so too was the use of fire weapons in the European theatre. But a late-war British invention, the white phosphorus munition, would go on to be a weapon that humans wished they had not invented. Inspired by Fenian's fire, a cocktail invented by Irish nationalists before the formation of the IRA. Initially used as a smokescreen for advancing troops, artillery crews quickly learned that if they could land their white phosphorus rounds among the enemy lines, they could rain down a firestorm that no amount of water could extinguish. Burning at over 1,500 degrees, the white smoke and embers consumed everything it landed on. But a weapon even more insidious would be deployed by US forces from the air: napalm. Using this jelly-like petroleum derivative would be like throwing a 5-gallon bucket of Vaseline mixed with gas on an individual, then setting them on fire. It got into every gap and space within a fortification, burning with equal ferocity. Once it landed on skin, it was impossible to remove. The liquid would burn until the petroleum chemicals were spent. Even more gruesome was the fact that many victims inhaled the flaming chemicals, burning out their respiratory system. So even if they did survive the flames, they would die from respiratory failure. Finally, the black smoke from the chemicals would temporarily blind a person, as well as inflame the nasal passage, causing uncontrollable coughing and making an individual soldier easy pickings for any enemy passing nearby. 4 separate metaphorical crossroads would intersect the war against Japan that would create a perfect scenario for the destruction of a nation by fire. 1. The near annihilation of the Japanese Air Force, denying Japan the ability to defend itself by air. 2. the building materials used in Japanese homes for centuries back being conducive to feeding fast-moving fires. 3. The invention of the M69 incendiary bomb, also called Tokyo calling cards. These small 6-pound devices filled with napalm would be placed dozens at a time into larger shells called cluster bombs that would automatically open at 2,000 feet above the ground, creating a shotgun blast, if you will, of about 40 incendiary devices. A single B-29 bomber could release 1,500 of these bomblets onto a city essentially made of matchboxes. On a side note, the US military experimented with bats being used as delivery devices for incendiary weapons, codenamed Project X-Ray. Mexican free-tailed bats would be released from a bomber at dawn with tiny, timed set devices. Those bats would then disperse over a 40-mile radius and proceed to nest in the attics of Japanese homes built with extremely flammable materials. The idea was not as far-fetched as it seems. A testing facility called the Japanese Village was built in Utah to test these bioweapons. After tests were conducted, the military gave its report as such. A reasonable number of destructive fires can be started in spite of the extremely small size of the units. The biggest advantage is the placement of the devices into enemy structures before knowledge of the danger is discovered. The project was later abandoned after several fires were started on base at the facility the bats were being tested at. It seems the bats were as great a threat to friendly structures as to the enemies. As stated before, there were 4 crossroads that met to create a perfect firestorm. The fourth and final road was the one of racial animosity. The Europeans had long since ceased using fire against one another. In short, it was probably too much for soldiers to burn alive people that looked like them. Unfortunately, in the Pacific Theatre, such reservations didn't exist between the Japanese and Americans. Unrestrained hatred would explode between Japan and America, with Japanese propaganda posters making Americans out to be personified, wandering evil spirits, and American propaganda art showing the Japanese soldiers to be spiders or sea creatures of some kind. If any of these 4 roads of innovation and social conditioning had not come to pass, then the events of the 10th of March 1945 may well have not taken place. On that day, over 270 B-29 bombers would unleash a hell on Earth, dropping their firebombs on an unsuspecting Tokyo population fast asleep in their beds. The fires that ensued over the next 48 hours would wipe out the eastern part of the city. No one is certain how many people lost their lives on that night, but it's universally agreed upon that the firebombing of Tokyo killed more people than either single atomic bomb attack later in the year. Most likely, over 100,000 people would lose their lives. People didn't just die in the firestorm, they simply disappeared in the flames as if they never existed. Reports of firefighters attempting to move deceased bodies on the ground, only to have the bodies crumble into ash, were widespread. Simply put, the Japanese were defenseless at preventing any future such attacks on their homeland. How this factored into the eventual Japanese surrender to American forces is uncertain, but it had to be in the back of the Emperor's mind as his government signed the peace treaty that ended the war. Last but not least, we need to discuss the most famous fire weapon ever made, the flamethrower. Interestingly enough, it was the Japanese that first used the concept of individual men throwing fire at an enemy, as opposed to Greek fire that was primarily a naval weapon. In the siege of Port Arthur, Japanese engineers would use hand-pump hoses to spray kerosene into Russian trenches, which were then set ablaze by burning rags. It was a German former firefighter, Bernhard Redmann, that would invent the concept we know today as the flamethrower. The word in English itself is a loan word from the German, Flammenwerfer. Redmann converted steam engines into fire weapons. The first man-portable flamethrower would be invented by Richard Fiedler. Interestingly enough, Redmann and Fiedler worked together to improve the device that would go on to haunt the nightmares of soldiers throughout the First World War. During the duration of the war, there were 650 documented uses of the flamethrower by German forces. Enter the M2 flamethrower, an American icon of individual power and brutality. The weapon entered the American psyche due to its extensive use against the Japanese in World War II and continued use during the Vietnam conflict. Over 14,000 of these 70-pound devices would be made. Despite its enduring legacy, the weapon had many drawbacks. It was a very heavy weapon that dramatically decreased its user's mobility. It also had a short effective range of about 60 feet, meaning that the user had to get dangerously close to an enemy in order for the weapon to be effective. Lastly, the weapon only offered roughly 7 seconds of continuous usage. Putting all of these facts together, one was left with a heavy weapon that needed a lot of support from surrounding soldiers to provide its user with a few seconds of intense flame-throwing ability. But that's all that was needed. This weapon was very effective against bunkers, pillboxes, and spider holes. The last example being a deep hole able to hide 1 or 2 soldiers using camouflage of some kind. The weapon would be famously used against the Japanese hiding in the many caves of both Iwo Jima and Saipan. Of course, the weapon killed mercilessly, so any civilian hiding among the entrenched Japanese soldiers also met the same fate. The Empire of Japan met its demise at the end of the United States military's metaphorical boot, one that the resource-poor island nation could hardly resist in the last year of the war. America's choice to use fire weapons extensively against the Japanese proved that the war in the Pacific would be one of annihilation. Not unlike Japan's war against China that had raged on for 10 years prior to America's entry into the Second World War. In the years since the Vietnam conflict, the production of flame weapons of all kinds has been on the decrease for one reason or another. Whether it be treaties or the use of more effective smart bombs, whatever the reason, it appears that the use of fire to kill an enemy will soon come to a deserved end. But the memory and legacy of fire and humanity's ability to harness it to dispatch its so-called undesirables will forever haunt our history books and documentaries. Thank you for watching Yes Japan. Please like and subscribe if you found this video entertaining. The end of the United States.